Grade 7s. Today we're going to talk about how to read poetry and how we make meaning. And when I say make meaning, I mean how we look at a poem and all of the devices used and what the poet is doing in order to understand the message they're trying to send us through poetry. So before I start, if you have not done the previous lesson was about poetic terms and devices. So if you haven't already done that, I would recommend that you do it before this. We're going to be talking about different terms that we would have discussed in the previous lesson, so it's good for you to know those before you do this lesson. So just a heads up before we get started here. So does this ever happen to you? Your teacher assigns a poem for you to read, you glance at it, and you have no idea what you are supposed to get out of this poem. So today we're going to discuss how to solve a problem. And there is a simple equation that you can use to solve this problem when it comes to reading a poem and trying to understand the message the author is trying to send. You need to remember content plus form equals meaning. Now, I know that doesn't really make sense right now, but I'm going to go into each of those terms and explain what I mean when I say content and what I mean when I say form. So what's the content of a poem? The content of a poem is made up of usually things. The first of these is the figurative language that's used. So in our previous lesson, we discussed different poetic devices and terms that are used, that the poet might use in order to allow you to understand what they're trying to say. Some of these might consist of simile, metaphor, hyperbole, personification. Those are all different types of figurative language an author might use in a poem. If you're not sure of the terms, like I said, go back, do the previous lesson, or flip through the slides. The next two is topic and theme. So the topic is basically what the poet is writing about, and the theme is sort of the subject matter that runs throughout. So in the previous lesson, I showed you a poem about written from the perspective of a man who was heartbroken over a girl. The topic would have been love, and the theme, you could say the theme maybe was heartbreak, maybe it was sadness. So that's an example of topic and theme. The next one is the author's tone. And again, as we discussed in the previous lesson, there is a difference between tone and mood. The author's tone is how the poet himself feels about his subject matter. Mood is how we feel the poem. So what makes up the content of a poem is the author's feeling towards his subject matter that he's discussing in the poem, or she. The last one is also imagery. So imagery consists of the descriptive language that the poet is using as they're writing. And this descriptive language can kind of be about the five senses. So the poet might be describing the scene based on what they're seeing or feeling or hearing, for example. And all of that, those descriptive words come together to create imagery. And when a poem has imagery, you should be able to create a picture of that poem in your mind. So as I said, figurative language when the author uses words or expressions that go beyond their normal meanings. And I did give some examples earlier. That is part of what we look when we look at the content of a poem. Tone and theme. Tone is the author's attitude towards the subject, and theme is what the poem is based on or the poem is about. That also makes up the content of a poem. Imagery is descriptive language, and the language that's used, does it allow you to create a picture in your mind? So those things all together create the poem's content. So that's what I mean when I say content. Now moving on to form. So what makes up the form of a poem? So the form of a poem consists of the poem type, the structure, the lengths of the lines, and also the rhyme scheme. And we discussed a lot of that again in our last lesson. A poem type depends on the emotions the poem is trying to make you feel, as well as the story that it's trying to tell. So going back to that example from our previous lesson, the story that the poem was trying to tell was about a man who was heartbroken over a lost love, and the emotions in the poem, some of the emotions that we could have felt maybe were sadness, anger, heartbreak. Structure and line length. So a poem can be in stanzas. Stanzas are a set of 4 lines that are grouped together, or they can be in couplets, which is just 2 rhyming lines. Most of the time, a couplet is at the end of a poem. Sometimes a poem can just be made up of several couplets, several sets of 2 rhyming lines. Some poems contain line lengths that are short, and others contain line lengths that are long, and the author or the poet will use these strategically depending on the poem. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it's something to keep in mind about the form. Rhyme scheme is just the pattern of the rhymes in the poem, and we discussed rhyme scheme in length in our previous lesson and how to determine a rhyme scheme of a poem. And some poems may use what we call exact rhyme, where words rhyme exactly with one another, such as cat and bat. Others may use slant rhyme, where if the words were said fast enough, they could rhyme. Some poems may even contain a combination of the two different types of rhyme. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you a poem called Nothing Gold Can Stay. It's by Robert Frost. And we're going to look at both the content and the form in order to create meaning or in order to gain a better understanding of what Robert Frost is trying to tell us in the poem. So it's called Nothing Gold Can Stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. So, if we look at the content, a really good hint as well, grade 7s, is to usually look at the title of a poem, because sometimes the title itself actually gives hints to some of the meaning of the poet's words as you begin to read. So I have up here, paying close attention to the title can be helpful, and it can give hints about the message the author's trying to send. So what are some words that we think of when we think of gold? So some words that might come to mind are beautiful, valuable, expensive. So when we think about this, when we read the poem, what do you think that Frost is trying to say? So here he discusses nature's first green. And to me, that sounds like it is referring to the spring, because that is when nature's first green would start, after winter stops and spring begins. So in here, he sees nature's first green is gold. Now, if we think of gold, I mean, that's valuable. He's saying basically that beginning of spring is valuable, it's beautiful, her hardest hue told. Now, we also notice in there that there is some alliteration, because he does have most of the words in that sentence begin with the same consonant, which is H. He's also referring to the fact that when it is spring and all of the new kind of green is coming to the plants and the flowers are blooming, those bright hues are the hardest ones to hold because they don't last very long. As he says down here, he refers to only so an hour, meaning that to him, this time when nature's first green comes, it feels like a very short amount of time. Leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So Eden is into like the Garden of Eden, which is known in the Bible as a beautiful garden. Sank to grief, meaning that eventually this sort of went away. Dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. So in the title and in the last sentence, he repeats the same line. And maybe you can think about what you think the lesson is here. We could say that maybe Frost is referring to the spring and how the spring doesn't last very long. Or maybe Frost's poem actually has a hidden deeper meaning. Maybe he's talking about in the world generally that things that we see as beautiful or valuable are not exactly permanent ever. So you can look at it from maybe he's talking specifically about nature. Maybe he's talking about life more broadly. When you look at the form, you notice that the poem is made up of 4 sets of rhyming couplets, and the rhyme scheme is A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D. And also that when we look at the form as well, he's got as I said earlier, his title, and the title is also the last line of the poem. So looking at both content and form can help us develop meaning. But we also have to remember, too, that meaning can also be subjective. What I might take from this poem as a meaning might be different than what you get from the poem when you're reading it. But those are some important things to point out about both content and form and how they help us together develop understanding of a poem that we're reading. So your assignment for today is I've given you a copy of a poem in the classroom. It's called Truth. And I want you to fill out the Google Doc that goes with it and identify the content and the structure or the form of the poem. Now, some of the figurative language parts that I've put in, they might not necessarily be in the poem, but I just tried to put as many types of figurative language in there so that you could see whether or not you can find those in the poem as you read it. And I will show you the page that you'll be filling out in a minute. At the end, you're going to write a paragraph, about 5 sentences, explaining what you think the poem means. Remember, the poem that you're analyzing is not the same one we've done in this lesson. It's a separate one called Truth, and it will be attached to your assignment in the classroom. So, here's the assignment. You're going to read the poem Truth and answer and analyze the following questions about the poem. So, content I have, please look at the poem and identify the topic, tone, simile, metaphor, personification. Again, you may not have all of these things in the poem Truth as you read it. Just fill out the ones that are there. There are also questions about form. Explain if you can find exact rhyme in the poem or any slant rhyme, and also tell me what a rhyme scheme is, as we would have worked on in our previous lesson, which is how to determine what the rhyme poem is. Poem structure, all you have to do is circle. You have to highlight. You just have to highlight one of the choices below and tell me whether the poem Truth is organized in stanzas or in sets of couplets. Finally, down here, you'll write 5 sentences about what the poem Truth is trying, what it might mean, and what mood it's setting, and maybe what message the poet is trying to send to the reader. What I would ask you not to do is please don't Google this poem for the answers, because you will not find them. So just use your own good judgment and what you've learned from this lesson in order to fill out the poem analysis sheet. So I see the poem that your sheet over is called Truth, and it is also attached in your classroom assignment. If you have any questions, let me know. Message me in the classroom or on the assignment. Send me a Gmail message, whatever you can do, and we'll be chatting soon. Bye-bye.